Most people think 2 a.m. is just a time to sleep, but Kathryn Kuhlman discovered something that would only happen when the world was silent and the clock hit that hour. What she did, alone in the dark, became the very reason miracles followed her. No stage, no spotlight, just one secret hour that changed everything, and the truth is, it's not just for her, it's for you too, if you don't ignore it. There's something about 2 a.m. that the world doesn't talk about, but heaven does. It's the hour most people ignore, dismiss as unimportant, or simply sleep through. But for those who are sensitive, for those who've been called into something deeper, 2 a.m. is not just a number on the clock. It's an invitation to step out of the noise and into a silence where something divine begins to stir. The world sleeps, but the spirit begins to wake up. Kathryn Kuhlman knew something about this hour that most overlook. She understood that when the lights are off, when the phones stop ringing, and when the chaos of the day fades into the background, the soul finally becomes quiet enough to hear what it's been missing. The late night isn't just an empty space between today and tomorrow. It's a sacred window where purpose whispers, where healing breathes, and where clarity starts to form like morning fog beginning to lift. Most people wait for a sign during the day. They wait for a sermon, a conversation, a push from someone else. But Kathryn, she didn't wait. She went straight into the stillness while the rest of the world was distracted or asleep. She knew that some of the most important answers don't shout. They whisper, and if you're too busy to listen, you'll miss them. That's why 2 a.m. mattered, not because of magic, not because of superstition, but because of stillness, because when everything else quiets down, the truth has room to speak. There's a kind of honesty that only shows up at 2 a.m. You know what I mean. It's when the day has drained you, when the mask comes off, when the performance ends. There's no audience left. It's just you raw, tired, open, and in that vulnerability, in that sacred exhaustion, something beautiful happens. You become real with yourself. You start to ask questions you've been avoiding. You face fears you've buried, and for people like Kathryn, that's where transformation begins. Not on a stage, not with applause, but alone in a room, heart trembling, spirit open. She once said it wasn't the crowds that made her powerful. It was the quiet places. That's where she connected with something far beyond herself, and 2 a.m. became her classroom. That's when she received clarity, not confusion, power, not panic, direction, not distraction, and she didn't guard that hour casually. She protected it. She didn't treat it as leftover time. She treated it as the most important meeting of her day, because in that space she wasn't just asking for things. She was becoming someone. She was being shaped, molded, and renewed. And here's what most people miss. Transformation doesn't shout, it whispers. You won't always feel fireworks at 2 a.m. You might not cry. You might not even feel a break through every time, but there's a shift that happens when you consistently show up. You begin to build something that can't be built in broad daylight. You build discipline. You build awareness. You build spiritual muscle. Kathryn wasn't just hoping for a miracle. She was preparing herself to carry one. The world wants results. It wants instant impact. But Kathryn understood something deeper. Impact is the result of intimacy, and intimacy is built in hidden hours. Hours like 2 a.m. when nobody's watching. When it doesn't look glamorous, when it doesn't feel easy, but that's when the real work happens. That's when you choose to listen instead of scroll, to sit instead of sleep, to lean in instead of tune out. And it's in those moments, those unseen, quiet moments, that your life begins to take a new shape. Your decisions begin to shift. Your energy changes. You begin to recognize things you never noticed before. You are no longer rushing through life trying to find answers. You are grounded, clear, and aware. You carry a calm that others can't explain, a strength that isn't loud, but unshakable. That's the kind of presence Kathryn carried. It wasn't because she was trying to be impressive. It was because she had already been impressed upon, in the quiet, in the dark, when no one saw. So don't ignore this hour. Don't brush past it like it's nothing. If your spirit is stirring at 2 a.m., maybe that's not restlessness. Maybe that's a calling. Maybe it's your moment. Maybe it's your invitation to step away from everything you think you need and sit in the presence of what's actually shaping you. Because when the world is asleep and your soul is awake, something powerful is happening. You just have to be willing to meet it. Kathryn Kuhlman didn't stumble into power. She didn't wake up one day with spiritual authority pouring out of her. What people saw on the stage, the miracles, the presence, the undeniable atmosphere, was born in places no one ever witnessed. One of those places was 2 a.m., when the world rolled over in bed or scrolled through distractions. Kathryn was in pursuit of something greater. Something the natural eye couldn't see but the spirit could deeply feel. She had discovered the pattern, hidden but powerful, of midnight intercession. It wasn't forced, it wasn't for show, it was desire. It was hunger, it was surrender. Kathryn was known for her deep relationship with the invisible. She often spoke as if the Holy Spirit was standing right beside her, closer than the people in front of her. That kind of intimacy doesn't come from routine prayer or rehearsed words. It comes from raw, honest time in the secret place, and for her, that place often came alive when the clock struck 2 a.m. While others chased the applause, she chased presence. While others prepared sermons, she prepared her soul. There's a difference between performance and presence, and Kathryn knew it. She didn't pray at 2 a.m. to get a platform. She prayed at 2 a.m. because it was where her soul breathed. Where she wasn't Kathryn the speaker or Kathryn the healer. She was simply a surrendered vessel, whispering in the dark, "I can't do this without you." That kind of vulnerability has power. It changes the atmosphere, but first, it changes the person. Kathryn's midnight hours weren't transactional. She wasn't just asking for blessings. She was letting go of burdens. She was emptying herself of ego, of fear, of pride, so that something greater could fill her. Her prayer life wasn't about getting more from God. It was about giving more of herself to Him. She understood the price of carrying something sacred. She often said the Holy Spirit could be grieved, that His presence was gentle, easily missed, easily pushed aside. So she treated those hours like sacred appointments, not out of duty, but out of awe. And in that awe, in that quiet, trembling reverence, she began to hear things no one else could. She began to sense shifts, feel leadings, receive direction. But only because she was listening when no one else was. Kathryn wasn't supernatural because she was special. She was supernatural because she was surrendered. And that surrender showed up most clearly in the private hours, in the places without cameras, where no one applauded, where no one even knew what she was doing. But heaven knew, and that's why heaven moved through her. What happens in those 2 a.m. hours is not about emotion. It's about alignment. It's about coming into agreement with what's already been prepared for your life. It's not begging for miracles. It's preparing to carry them. Kathryn's pattern of late night intercession wasn't religious habit. It was relationship. She didn't just talk. She listened. She waited. She wept. And in that waiting, something deeper was born, authority that couldn't be shaken. Because authority doesn't come from volume, it comes from depth. and depth is built in silence. So when Kathryn stood on stage and miracles began to break out, it wasn't hype, it was overflow. It was the result of hours and hours spent in quiet rooms when everyone else was asleep, but she was awake, not just physically, but spiritually, alert, ready, listening. That's why we can't dismiss the pattern. Not just because Kathryn followed it, but because it works. Because something happens when we consistently meet God in the places no one else sees. Not to earn approval, not to impress, but to become. To align, to be emptied and filled again. If you're searching for purpose, if you're desperate for clarity, if you've been asking for breakthrough, maybe the answer isn't in doing more. Maybe it's in surrendering more. Maybe it's in learning what Kathryn knew, that the late night isn't empty, it's alive, that when the world is silent, heaven speaks. You just have to be willing to listen. When the world is asleep and the lights are off, something shifts in the atmosphere. Not because of superstition, but because stillness makes space for sensitivity. Kathryn Kuhlman understood this better than most. She recognized that when distractions die down, the deeper part of us, our spirit, finally begins to speak. But more importantly, it begins to listen. That's why 2 a.m. was never wasted for her. It wasn't just quiet, it was charged. It wasn't just empty, it was expectant. People often ask, why do I feel something different at night? Why does my heart stir when everything else is calm? The answer is simple. When the noise of the day fades, the whispers become clearer. But most people push those whispers away. They numb them with noise, scroll past them with content, or drown them in sleep. Kathryn didn't. She leaned in. She let the silence speak. And through that, she began to move in a way the rest of the world couldn't understand. When she stepped onto a stage, people felt something. Rooms changed, atmospheres shifted. It wasn't just charisma, it was weight. And weight doesn't come from public practice. It comes from private posture. Kathryn had learned that the more time she spent in stillness, the more sensitive she became to the invisible. While most people trained their minds, she trained her spirit. And it was that training, done not in a classroom, but in the dark hours of the night, that made her different. She believed that 2 a.m. wasn't random. That there are moments when the veil between heaven and earth feels thinner, not because the time is magical, but because your mind is finally free enough to focus. No appointments, no pressure, just openness. Kathryn didn't treat those hours casually. She didn't wait for convenience. She made a choice. She created space for presence, knowing full well that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. And here's the part most people miss. When you start to create that space regularly, your entire internal world starts to change. You begin to feel things you used to ignore. You sense when something is right and when something isn't. You speak slower, you react softer, you carry a peace that confuses people. Why? Because you've trained your spirit to lead instead of your emotions. And that training often begins at night, when you finally slow down enough to pay attention. Kathryn never needed the spotlight to feel important. She didn't crave affirmation. She craved alignment. And she knew that if she could be aligned in the private hours, she wouldn't have to perform in the public ones. That's the secret many people overlook. Public confidence comes from private clarity, and clarity is born in the quiet. That's why she never ignored 2 a.m. She embraced it. She understood that while the world sleeps, the spirit awakens. You don't need to be a preacher, a healer, or a public figure to step into this. All you need is hunger, hunger for something more than surface. Hunger to know who you really are when no one's looking. Hunger to sit in stillness long enough to hear something deeper than the noise you're used to. Because once you taste that kind of presence, once you feel that kind of clarity, everything else starts to fade. The opinions, the pressure, the confusion, it all begins to dissolve in the quiet. So when 2 a.m. comes and you feel that nudge, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off. Don't say maybe tomorrow. Because tomorrow never speaks as clearly as the silence of tonight.